the 1920s in America was a decade of dazzling contradictions. On one hand, jazz music filled the airwaves, automobiles replaced horses on city streets, and a new sense of optimism swept through the nation after the horrors of the First World War. The Roaring Twenties promised prosperity, freedom, and a brighter future. But beneath the glitter of speakeasies and flapper dresses, millions of children lived in a reality far removed from the celebrations. For them, the 1920s was a time of transformation, sometimes wonderful, often harsh, and always unforgettable. By 1918, every state in America had passed compulsory education laws, requiring children between the ages of 8 and 14 to attend school. This was a revolutionary shift. For the first time in history, the nation collectively agreed that children deserved an education, yet the implementation was uneven. Rural children walked miles to reach one-room schoolhouses. Urban children from immigrant families juggled schoolwork with factory jobs. And for the poorest among them, education remained a distant dream overshadowed by the immediate need to survive. This is the true story of what it meant to be a child 100 years ago, a story of wooden rulers and coal mines, of playgrounds and punishment, of innocence lost and resilience found. And by the end, you may find yourself wondering, how much has really changed? Imagine walking 2 miles through snow-covered fields before the sun rises, carrying your lunch in a tin pail, knowing that if you arrive late, a wooden cane awaits you. This was the daily reality for millions of American children in the 1920s, particularly those living in rural areas where one-room schoolhouses dotted the countryside like lonely sentinels of learning. These humble buildings, often no larger than a modest living room, served children of all ages simultaneously. A 6-year-old learning the alphabet might sit just feet away from a 14-year-old studying algebra. One teacher managed everything: lessons, discipline, heating the wood stove, and sometimes even preparing meals. The curriculum focused on the fundamentals: arithmetic, penmanship, and what was then called nature study. But there were also lessons in singing, country dancing, and practical skills like sewing for girls and woodwork for boys. Hygiene became an increasingly important subject as public health awareness grew throughout the decade. What made these schoolhouses remarkable was not their facilities, were often primitive, but their role as community centers. They hosted town meetings, holiday celebrations, and served as the social glue binding isolated farming communities together. For many children, the schoolhouse was the only place they encountered peers their own age, the only escape from the endless labor of farm life. But do not mistake this for an idyllic scene. The discipline inside those wooden walls was absolute, and as we shall soon discover, the punishments teachers employed would be considered abuse by modern standards. The phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child" was not merely a saying in the 1920s, it was a governing philosophy. Teachers ruled their classrooms with an authority that today seems almost unimaginable, and physical punishment was not just accepted but expected. The most common method was known as chalk and talk. Teachers lectured while students memorized. Questioning the teacher was unthinkable. Creativity was discouraged. Education meant rote, learn-less repetition, until information was burned into memory. And for those who failed to comply, consequences were swift and painful. A student who misbehaved might be forced to write a sentence 100 times. I must not speak out of turn. But for more serious infractions, the cane or ruler came out. Children, as young as 6, received strikes across their open palms. Some teachers favored a wooden paddle applied to the back of the legs. Others made students kneel on dried corn kernels for extended periods. These were not isolated incidents committed by cruel individuals. They were standard educational practices endorsed by school boards across the nation. And the punishment did not end at school. Parents, upon learning of their child's misbehavior, often administered what was euphemistically called a clip around the ear, a sharp slap to the side of the head. The philosophy was consistent. Children needed strict boundaries, and pain was the most effective teacher. Remarkably, many who survived these methods later defended them, claiming that discipline built character. But there was something even more troubling awaiting children outside the schoolhouse. While something that would steal their childhoods entirely. While some children worried about wooden rulers, millions of others faced dangers far more severe. In the 1920s, child labor remained a grim reality despite decades of reform efforts. Children as young as 8 worked in coal mines, textile factories, canneries, and on farms. Their small hands, considered ideal for tasks adults could not perform. In the coal mines of West Virginia and Pennsylvania, young boys called breaker boys sat hunched over conveyor belts for 10 to 12 hours a day, picking slate and rock from rushing streams of coal. The work destroyed their backs, blackened their lungs, and often cost them fingers. They earned pennies while mine owners became millionaires. In textile mills across the South, Children operated dangerous machinery that regularly claimed limbs. Factory owners preferred child workers because they could be paid less, complained less, and their small bodies could crawl beneath massive looms to retrieve fallen threads. The heat was suffocating, the noise was deafening, and the shifts lasted from sunrise to well past sunset. In 1903, an 83-year-old woman with white hair and fierce eyes led hundreds of child workers on a march from Philadelphia to New York, a journey that would expose the horrors of child labor to the entire nation. Her name was Mary Harris Jones, known to all as Mother Jones, and her words still echo through history. Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. Mother Jones had witnessed suffering that would have broken most people. Born in Ireland during the Great Famine, she immigrated to America only to lose her husband and all 4 children to yellow fever. Later, she lost everything again in the Great Chicago Fire. Rather than surrender to despair, she dedicated her life to fighting for workers' rights, particularly the rights of children. The march she organized in 1903 was designed to shame politicians and industrialists into action. The children who walked with her bore the physical evidence of factory work: missing fingers, hunched spines, faces aged far beyond their years. Mother Jones called them the living proof of industrial greed. Newspapers covered the march extensively, and though President Theodore Roosevelt refused to meet with her, the publicity galvanized the child labor reform movement. By the 1920s, Mother Jones was still fighting. During the 1920 to 1921 mine strikes in West Virginia, she continued her advocacy, her voice as powerful as ever. She died in 1930, at approximately 93 years old, having witnessed significant progress, but knowing the fight was far from over. Federal child labor laws would not be firmly established until 1938, with the Fair Labor Standards Act. Her legacy reminds us that the childhood protections we take for granted today were purchased with decades of struggle. But even as reformers fought for children's rights, a new force was emerging that would reshape childhood in unexpected ways. In rural Minnesota and across the American heartland, a peculiar sight greeted farmers every morning. A large wooden wagon, pulled by horses, filled with up to 20 children, bundled against the cold. These were the first school buses, horse-drawn vehicles designed to solve a simple problem. How do you get children to school when they live miles from the nearest schoolhouse? The design of these wagons revealed practical ingenuity. Children entered from the rear rather than the front, specifically to avoid startling the horses. The interiors were cramped, often with simple wooden benches, and in winter hay was spread on the floor for insulation. Some wagons featured small wood-burning stoves, though these presented obvious fire hazards. The journey could take over an hour each way, transforming the simple act of attending school into a daily adventure. By the mid-1920s, motorized school buses began appearing, though they remained rare and expensive. The transition from horse-drawn to motor-powered transport symbolized the broader changes sweeping America. A nation caught between its agricultural past and its industrial future. Children who rode in those early buses were living through a technological revolution that would reshape every aspect of daily life. But transportation was not the only area where childhood was being transformed. A new concept was emerging in American households, one that would change the relationship between parents and children forever. And it all began with something called scientific parenting. For most of human history, children were raised according to tradition. Parents did what their parents had done, which was what their grandparents had done before them. But in the 1920s, something remarkable happened. Experts began telling parents there was a right way and a wrong way to raise children. Science could determine which was which. Parents born around 1900 became the first generation to embrace scientific. Children's books and magazines offered detailed advice on nutrition, hygiene, sleep schedules, and emotional development. Children should eat specific foods at specific times. They should sleep certain hours. They should be exposed to fresh air and sunlight. Suddenly, parenting was no longer instinctivity, was technical. This new approach brought genuine benefits. Parents paid more attention to children's health, leading to better nutrition and medical care. Educational toys appeared in stores, designed to stimulate young minds. Music lessons, art classes, and dancing instruction became aspirations for middle-class families, eager to give their children advantages they themselves never had. But scientific parenting also carried anxieties. Films like The Child Grows Up produced in the 1920s, warned parents about the dangers of street play, improper diet, and inadequate ventilation. Childhood diseases like polio haunted every parent has nightmares if you want to understand the terror that disease brought to families. We have a complete video on this channel exploring the polio epidemic in depth. The message was clear. Childhood was fragile, and only constant vigilance could protect it. The generation gap began to shrink as parents took greater interest in their children's lives. Family conversations became more open. Children were increasingly treated as individuals, with their own thoughts and feelings, rather than simply small adults waiting to become useful. This shift laid the groundwork for modern childhood. It also created new tensions that worried social observers. As cities grew and tenement buildings multiplied, reformers began asking a troubling question. Where were urban children supposed to play? Streets were increasingly dangerous, filled with automobiles, horse carts, and the chaos of industrial life. Apartments were cramped, and idle children, everyone agreed, were children at risk of delinquency. The solution was the playground movement. Parks and recreational spaces specifically designed for children spread across American cities throughout the 1920s. Swings, seesaws, and sandboxes appeared in urban neighborhoods that had previously offered only concrete and danger. The YMCA expanded its youth programs. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts grew from modest beginnings into national organizations with hundreds of thousands of members. These organizations were not merely about fun day, were about building character. Scout programs taught wilderness skills, civic responsibility, and moral values. The playground movement emphasized physical health and supervised play. Reformers believed that properly organized recreation could prevent juvenile crime, build strong bodies, and create the citizens' democracy required. Classic games that had entertained children for generations, hopscotch, marbles, hide-and-seek now, had dedicated spaces where they could be played safely. For urban children accustomed to dodging traffic, these playgrounds represented small oases of genuine childhood. Yet not all observers were optimistic. Some worried that movies, radio, and the general excitement of modern life were corrupting youth. They saw the 1920s as a supercharged era that exposed children to influences their parents could not control. While urban reformers built playgrounds and scouted troops, the majority of American children still lived on farms. Their experience of the 1920s was profoundly different from their city cousins shaped, more said, seasons and harvests than by movies and radio. Farm children worked. There is no romanticizing this reality. From the age of 5 or 6, they helped with chores that modern children would find unimaginable. Milking cows before dawn, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, helping with planting and harvesting, caring for younger siblings. While parents worked the fields, childhood on a farm was preparation for adulthood, on a farm a continuous apprenticeship in survival. Yet within this demanding life, there were moments of genuine joy. Swimming in creeks during summer, exploring woods that seemed endless, the freedom of open spaces that city children could only dream about. Farm children may have worked harder, but they also experienced a connection to nature that urbanization was steadily erasing. The one-room schoolhouse served as the great equalizer in rural communities. Rich farmers' children sat beside poor sharecroppers' children. The teacher commanded respect from all. Education represented hope, the possibility that a child might escape the endless cycle of agricultural labor and find a different life. By the end of the 1920s, this rural world was already beginning to fade. The Great Depression would accelerate changes that the decade had set in motion. Mechanization would transform farming. Migration to cities would empty rural communities. The children who grew up in those one-room schoolhouses would be among the last to experience that particular version of American childhood. As the 1920s drew to a close, children across America had no idea what awaited them. The stock market crash of October 1929 would shatter the prosperity that had defined a decade. The Great Depression would plunge millions of families into poverty more severe than anything they had previously experienced. But in 1928 and early 1929, optimism still reigned. Children played with new toys, mechanical banks, wind-up trains, and the first Mickey Mouse merchandise after its debut in 1928. They listened to radio programs designed specifically for young audiences. They attended movies that seemed like magic. The future appeared bright. The children of the 1920s would grow up to become the adults who fought World War II, built the post-war economy, and created the world we inherited. That child is marked by discipline we would consider harsh, labor we would consider exploitative, and freedoms we would consider dangerous somehow produced what many call the greatest generation. This is perhaps the most profound mystery of their experience. How did childhoods so different from our own produce adults capable of such remarkable achievements? Did the hardships they endured build resilience that comfort cannot create? Or did they succeed despite their difficult beginnings? Rather than because of them, these questions have no easy answers. But they remind us that childhood is not a fixed concept. What we consider normal, necessary, and beneficial for children changes dramatically across time and culture. The children of the 1920s would find modern childhoods bewildering, and we would find theirs unacceptable. A century has passed since those children walked to one-room schoolhouses, worked in coal mines, and played marbles in newly constructed playgrounds. Their world is gone, preserved only in photographs, documents, and the fading memories of their descendants. Yet their legacy surrounds us. The child labor laws that protect modern children were purchased with the suffering of children who had no such protection. The educational system we take for granted was built by reformers who believed every child deserved a chance to learn. The very concept of childhood as a protected stage of life, distinct from adulthood, deserving of special care, was still being invented in the 1920s. When we look back at their experiences, we should feel both gratitude and humility. Gratitude that progress has spared modern children from the worst hardships their great-great-grandparents endured. Humility because we cannot know how future generations will judge the childhoods we are creating today. Mother Jones, that fierce Irish immigrant who marched children to the gates of power, understood something profound. The way a society treats its children reveals its true values. The 1920s was a decade of contradictions, progress and exploitation, freedom and discipline, hope and fear. Sound familiar? Perhaps that is the real lesson of this journey into the past. Every generation faces the same fundamental challenge. How do we prepare children for an uncertain future, while protecting them from the dangers of the present? The answers change. The question never does. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself transported to those one-room schoolhouses and crowded tenements, consider subscribing to this channel. We explore forgotten chapters of history every week, bringing the past to life in ways that illuminate the present. Leave a comment sharing what surprised you most about childhood in the 1920s. Your engagement helps others discover these important stories. And if you want to keep exploring what life really felt like 100 years ago, I will leave a link in the first comment to an incredible ebook you can download filled with even more fascinating details about this extraordinary era. Until next time, remember, history is not just about the past. It is about understanding who we are and how we became this way.